Good morning, Grace Church. It is my delight to introduce to you the newest and the youngest pastor at Grace Church, Kevin Griffin, who'll be joining us right about the middle of June. Kevin, it's a delight to have you on our team, and welcome.
Thank you, George.
In today's Bible lesson that we're looking at, it's the story of this guy who had his life radically transformed by an encounter with Jesus. We know him as Paul, but he was Saul before that. He was a guy that terrorized the church, and then he became an instrument of God filled with the Spirit to take the good news of Jesus to Gentiles, to the non-Jews of his day. As a matter of fact, we're probably here because of him and his work. You've experienced amazing transformation in your own life. You've had some Paul on the Damascus Road experiences. Tell us how God has used those moments, those encounters, to set your life on a life of purpose and meaning for Him.
Sure. Well, I remember a couple of years ago, I was working with youth and student ministry and youth ministry, and I made a deal with God. I said that I'll serve you in your church. I'll work on a church staff as long as it's with teenagers and with young people, because I hate their parents. And I cannot stand the grown-ups and working with them because they just get whinier than the seventh graders. And so I learned after that it's always a bad idea to make a deal with God because you know what's about to happen. And so sure enough, I'm there with a group of young people. I'm in the Andes Mountains in Huancayo, Peru, this tiny remote village, third world setting. And there's a church service coming up where there was a person scheduled to preach who came down with altitude sickness. And an hour before the service said, Kevin, you're up. Now, part of my deal with God was I said, I don't want to deal with the parents of the youth, and I never want to preach a sermon. I'll give talks to teenagers, but I never want to do that. And so sure enough, I found myself having to preach at this service. Now, before I went, the person who was scheduled to do it said, don't worry, Kevin, I've written out my manuscript, take my notes, preach my notes. And I thought, okay, Lord, I can do this. So I grabbed the legal pad, I jumped on the bus, and as I left, John, who was going to preach, told me, Kevin, oh, and by the way, there'll be about 20 people there, so no pressure. Well, I show up and there's 300. and I walk in, and on the stage is Arthur, my friend, the missionary, as well as two other people with microphones. I said, Arthur, who are they? He said, oh, those are your two translators. It's going to be translated into Spanish and then into Quechuan for the Indians who don't speak Spanish. So you're going to preach line by line, and it's going to be translated 2 times before it comes back to you. And so then, I crossed myself and said, okay, let's look at this legal pad. And as I looked at it, John had written 3 words. He had written Jesus, grace, and love in a Bible verse. And I walked up on the stage and I started to speak. And as I did, it was a Damascus Road experience. I actually slipped my shoes off while I was on the stage because I realized this was one of those moments I was standing on holy ground. I realized, it's funny, George, I can't even tell you what I said that night. I preached a half-hour sermon, but what did happen is I realized that God told me, Kevin, this is what I made you to do, and for the rest of your life. This is the purpose that I have in mind for you. Now, what's funny about that and how it compares with a story like Paul and Ananias or Moses in the burning bush is that God revealed or nudged me with this purpose that He had in mind, but He didn't tell me the next step. He just gave me that and left the ball in my court and asked me to have the courage to follow that. And what I found then in other moments too is that tomorrow doesn't have to be a pointless repeat of today. Yeah. In my life or in your life or in any of our lives, is that Jesus actually came. We've already talked in this series about living in the now, in the present tense, releasing tomorrow and trusting that we don't have to wake up and go back to the same cubicle and do the same thing and pay the bills and put the kids to bed, is that Jesus actually came to fill our life abundantly with His purpose, not with mine, that tomorrow doesn't have to be a repeat of today. Yeah. Sometimes people in the church, I think unintentionally, talk about the purpose of God almost as if it's a penalty instead of a pleasure, It's like, okay, I got to go do God's will. Has it ever felt like that way for you? I mean, how has God moved it from penalty to pleasure, His purposes in your life? Sure. See, I feel like the word pleasure falls short.
Okay.
Because I think what applies is that in the times where my choices line up with His will, that I've become fully alive. Okay. That it's beyond pleasure, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it also scares the heck out of me. That's how I know when it's His purpose and not mine, is when it exceeds my own capacity of feeling like I have the gifts or the ability.
Amen.
I mean, would you agree that,
absolutely.
that God is stretching me to that point of, I mean, there's a reason, that in the story we're looking at today, that Paul was blind for 3 days, helpless, desperate, begging for God, not knowing what the next step is, that God takes me to that place beyond myself when I have nothing. That's when He's able to use me and make me fully alive.